Merci. Excellences, distingués collègues.
Excellencies, colleagues, I hereby open the 8th meeting of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council. I would like to inform you that the Division of Conference Management has prepared an online survey regarding the quality of conference services provided during this session. Participants present in the room may take part in the survey by scanning the QR code, which is up on the screen, using their smartphones or their tablets. Your comments are important for the Division of Conference Management, which does its best to organize more effective and efficient meetings, so I do encourage everybody to take part in the survey. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we will now continue with the interactive dialogue on the report by the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. We will continue with our list of speakers, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana aligns with the statement of the African Group. We thank the High Commissioner for his report, which has been very helpful to our understanding of the precarious human rights and acute humanitarian situation across the occupied Palestinian territories. Ghana commends the resilience of the Palestinian people in the face of the ongoing systematic violence. Ghana, like all other delegations, is deeply concerned about the displacement of the civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territories. Mr. President, as we have noted previously, demolition and seizures of Palestinian population. In closing, we urge all the parties to prioritize constructive dialogue and contribute meaningfully to deliver a secured and assured statehood for both Israel and Palestine. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. For 77 years of the nearly 80 years since the United Nations was founded out of the ashes of the gruesome World War II, the question of Palestine remains unresolved. For decades, the Palestinian people have faced formidable challenges in their quest for self-determination. The historical context of this struggle is rooted in the long-standing occupation and colonization of Palestinian territories by Israel, which has subjected generations to displacement, violence, and systemic oppression, plunging the region into turmoil and immense suffering unseen in modern history. We must recognize that the Palestinian people deserve the same rights and freedoms as any other people on earth. It's the recognition that a just and lasting peace can only be achieved through the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Eritrea reaffirms its unwavering support for the inherent rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and statehood. It is thus incumbent upon us to take decisive action to support a just and lasting resolution to this protracted conflict. We call for an immediate end to the aggression against Palestinian and neighboring countries and ensure the continuation of unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for all those in need. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
سعادة الرئيس، أخذ وفد بلادي سلطنة عمان علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان ويعرب عن تقديره للنتائج التي تضمنها التقرير رغم اقتناعنا بأن هذه النتائج لا تعكس بشكل كاف حجم المأساة التي يعيشها قطاع غزة، وذلك للأسباب التالية. أولا، الضغوط التي مورست على الأونروا وعلى المقرر الخاص بالأراضي العربية المحتلة وعلى المؤسسات الدولية الأخرى مما أثر على نتائج التقرير بشكل ملحوظ. ثانيا، المواقف الدولية وخصوصا من بعض الدول الغربية التي غالبا ما تتجاهل الحقوق الفلسطينية وتستند إلى معايير مزدوجة بالتعامل مع قضايا حقوق الإنسان مما يعكس انتقائية غير مقبولة في المعالجة. في هذا السياق نؤكد على ضرورة الالتزام بالمعايير التي وردت في التقرير وندعو إلى تبني التوصيات الخاصة بمغادرة الاحتلال لقطاع غزة دون شروط مع رفض أي محاولة للمساس بالحقوق الفلسطينية المشروعة. سعادة الرئيس، إن التقرير يفتقر إلى التوازن في معالجة الفجوة الكبيرة بين الأضرار التي لحقت بالضحايا الفلسطينيين بسبب الاحتلال والممارسات الإسرائيلية التي تسببت في دمار واسع في قطاع غزة، وأنه من غير المقبول أن يطلب من المجتمع الدولي أن يطالب الاحتلال بالسماح بإدخال الغذاء أو فرق الإسعاف، فهذه حقوق أساسية أقرها القانون الدولي، ويجب على المؤسسات الدولية أن تواصل الضغط لإنهاء هذه المأساة المستمرة منذ عقود. وشكرا سعادة الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. High Commissioner, thank you for your report and for today's update. After 16 months of conflict and devastating loss of civilian life, we welcome the announcement of a ceasefire and hostage agreement in Gaza. We urge all parties to implement the terms of the ceasefire fully. This includes the immediate release of all Israeli hostages, as well as the rapid and unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid into and throughout Gaza. We also urge all parties to engage in good faith negotiations to move beyond the current phase of the ceasefire towards a just and durable peace based upon the two-state solution. We cannot return to the conflict and suffering that we have seen over the past 16 months. We are deeply concerned by the officer's reports of ongoing serious violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and we echo the High Commissioner's call for accountability for violations and abuses of international law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Colombia reitera el llamado del presidente Gustavo Petro para que se ponga fin a la ocupación de los territorios palestinos y se detengan las acciones que constituyen una flagrante violación del derecho internacional. El uso de la fuerza indiscriminada, los bombardeos a la población civil, el bloqueo de acceso a ayuda humanitaria y la destrucción masiva de infraestructuras esenciales configuran patrones de posibles crímenes de guerra y crímenes de lesa humanidad que la comunidad internacional no puede ignorar. Denunciamos en los términos más enérgicos la tragedia humanitaria que se vive en Gaza y las sistemáticas violaciones a los derechos humanos del pueblo palestino. La situación descrita en el informe del Alto Comisionado, con miles de civiles asesinados, incluyendo mujeres y niños, desplazamientos forzados masivos y la destrucción deliberada de infraestructura esencial, no puede ser tolerada por esta comunidad de naciones. Colombia continuará apoyando todas las iniciativas que, en el marco del derecho internacional, permitan la búsqueda de justicia y la rendición de cuentas. En ese sentido, respaldamos las acciones emprendidas ante la CPI y la CIJ en aras de garantizar la investigación y sanción de los responsables de estas violaciones. Colombia espera que el actual cese al fuego se mantenga y se facilite el retorno seguro y digno de los palestinos a sus hogares. Es fundamental que se inicie cuanto antes la reconstrucción de Gaza. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russia.
Господин председатель, израильская военная операция в Газе прошлась в анклаве беспощадным катком по десяткам тысяч жизней, в том числе детей. Сегодня Газа лежит в руинах. Образовательная система и сфера здравоохранения парализованы. Фактически все школьные здания разрушены. Большая часть больниц перестала функционировать, что катастрофическим образом сказалось на доступе населения к медицинским услугам. Вышедший 31 декабря 2024 года доклад УВКПЧ подтвердил систематический и структурный характер нападений на медучреждения Газы. До сих пор нет окончательных данных по числу погибших. Гуманитарный персонал не успевает аккумулировать сведения по смертности, ставшей результатом голода, обезвоживания, антисанитарии или нарушения работы медицинских служб. До сих пор не разобраны завалы зданий, под которыми могут находиться тысячи тел. Достигнутое недавно благодаря усилиям египетских и катарских посредников, а также присоединившихся к ним на завершающем этапе представителей новой администрации США долгожданное соглашение о прекращении огня, безусловно, явилось важной вехой в регулировании ситуации в Газе. Однако поводов для радости пока немного. Гуманитарная катастрофа, продолжающаяся более 15 месяцев, никуда не исчезла. Сегодня всему мировому сообществу необходимо встать на защиту достигнутого прекращения огня и усилить голоса тех, кто выступает за мир в регионе. Призываем Верховного комиссара и его управление продолжать уделять пристальное внимание ситуации в регионе и регулярно информировать о ней Совет. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos al alto comisionado por la presentación de su informe. Bolivia expresa su preocupación por la situación de los derechos humanos en Gaza, Cisjordania, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, y rechazamos la ocupación ilegal de estos territorios. No hay palabras para describir el sufrimiento del pueblo palestino, siendo los niños y niñas los más afectados por los ataques militares de la potencia ocupante. Rechazamos cualquier intento de desplazamiento forzado del pueblo palestino de su territorio histórico. Condenamos el castigo colectivo, la violencia basada en el género, incluida violencia sexual, los casos de detención arbitraria, tortura y malos tratos, entre otras violaciones a los derechos humanos, y reiteramos el llamado a hacer por la justicia y no permitir la impunidad. Los responsables de vulneraciones del derecho internacional humanitario y del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos deben rendir cuentas de sus actos por la vía de mecanismos de justicia penal imparciales e independientes. Al mismo tiempo, no se debe perder de vista adoptar recursos efectivos que incluya una reparación integral de las víctimas. Bolivia se unió recientemente al Grupo de la Haya, reafirmando nuestro compromiso con el derecho internacional para impulsar el fin a la ocupación israelí a Palestina y eliminar los obstáculos a la realización del derecho del pueblo palestino a la autodeterminación. Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Cuba denuncia y condena en los términos más enérgicos el genocidio contra el pueblo palestino perpetrado por Israel, apoyado por las armas, los fondos y el veto de los Estados Unidos y el silencio cómplice de otros. La actual catástrofe humanitaria es continuidad de más de 7 décadas de ocupación ilegal, abusos, ataques y exclusión. ¿Cuántos niños y mujeres más deben ser masacrados para que la comunidad internacional actúe y brinde la protección internacional que necesita con urgencia el pueblo palestino? Cada minuto de impunidad y pasividad implica que más inocentes continuarán siendo asesinados, mutilados, detenidos y desplazados. Rechazamos cualquier plan para expulsar al pueblo palestino de su territorio, lo que tipificaría como un grave delito de limpieza étnica. Gaza pertenece a Palestina, no a Washington, no a Tel Aviv, no a nadie más. Demandamos respeto al derecho inalienable del pueblo palestino a la libre determinación y a construir su propio Estado independiente y soberano. No hay otra manera efectiva de detener la espiral de violencia, salvar vidas humanas y trazar un rumbo viable para la paz. Corresponde a este Consejo actuar para que los responsables y cómplices de esta barbarie tengan que rendir cuentas y asumir las consecuencias de sus actos. Muchas gracias.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Sénégal.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma délégation souscrit aux déclarations de ces groupes d'appartenance et remercie le Haut-Commissaire aux droits de l'homme pour la présentation de son rapport sur les territoires palestiniens occupés, y compris Jérusalem-Est. Le Sénégal reste vivement préoccupé par la gravité de la crise humanitaire dans la bande de Gaza, d'une ampleur inédite. Nous encourageons les efforts régionaux de médiation, ainsi que les initiatives visant à instaurer un cessez-le-feu permanent et à baliser la voie vers une sortie de crise. Nous appelons également à une action urgente et concertée pour la fourniture sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire, ainsi que de toute l'assistance nécessaire aux populations gazaouies dans le cadre de futurs efforts de reconstruction. Nous réaffirmons notre engagement en faveur d'un règlement pacifique du conflit et appelons la communauté internationale à toujours privilégier cette voie. Enfin, le Sénégal réitère son soutien aux droits inaliénables du peuple palestinien à l'autodétermination, ainsi que son attachement à la solution à 2 États, conformément aux résolutions pertinentes de l'ONU. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. High Commissioner, thank you for your update. Back on the 7th of October 2023, Israel suffered the worst terror attack in its history at the hands of Hamas. The hostages have since suffered an unbearable trauma. The people of Gaza, so many of whom have lost lives, homes, loved ones, have also experienced a living nightmare. We have been clear. Palestinian civilians must be permitted to return to their communities and rebuild. It is for Palestinians to determine the future of Gaza, and international humanitarian law must be respected. In the West Bank, the UK is deeply concerned at the expansion of Israel's war aims and operations. Civilians must be protected. But let me be clear, the UK is opposed to the existence of Item 7. We want to see all countries face appropriate scrutiny of their human rights record, but oppose the disproportionate focus of this item. Mr. President, the UK has urged all parties to sustain the ceasefire deal, implement the agreement in full, and support efforts to move to Phase 2 and a sustainable peace. Indeed, let me reaffirm once again our support for a credible pathway towards a peaceful future for both Palestinians and Israelis based on a two-state solution where they live side by side in peace, dignity and security. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
السيد الرئيس، إن المأساة الإنسانية للشعب الفلسطيني والجرائم البشعة والانتهاكات الصارخة والمنهجية التي ترتكبها إسرائيل القوى القائمة بالاحتلال ليست حديثة، ولا يمكن تبريرها بحق الدفاع عن النفس، فهي تمتد إلى أكثر من 7 عقود، وليس من العدل والإنصاف المساواة بين الجلاد والضحية. إن القطاصة الإسرائيلية وحالة الإفلات من العقاب السائدة والتي تعطيها شعورا بأنها فوق القانون تدفعها إلى الإمعان في تنفيذ جرائمها وانتهاكاتها في قطاع غزة والضفة الغربية، وتنفيذ سياسات العقاب الجماعي والتجويع والتدمير والاستهداف المتعمد للمرافق المدنية والمستشفيات ومنع المساعدات الإنسانية ومواصلة ممارستها العنصرية والاستيطانية ومحاولة تهويد القدس الشريف. وأمام هذه الانتهاكات وجرائم الإبادة التي ترتكبها قوات الاحتلال ندعو المجتمع الدولي إلى التخلي عن المعايير المزدوجة وممارسة المزيد من الضغط واتخاذ جميع الإجراءات اللازمة لضمان امتثال إسرائيل القوانين الدولية وضمان مساءلة جميع المسؤولين عن الانتهاكات والجرائم التي حدثت بحق الشعب الفلسطيني. تجدد دولة قطر ختاما رفضها القاطع لمحاولات تهجير الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضه، ونذكر بالرأي الاستشاري الصادر عن محكمة العدل الدولية في 19/2024، وندعو المجتمع الدولي إلى اتخاذ جميع الخطوات اللازمة لإنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي وحماية الشعب الفلسطيني وتنفيذ حل الدولتين والاعتراف بدولة فلسطين على حدود 67 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Je passe la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Mauritanie.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. يضم وفد بلادي صوته إلى دعوة المفوض السامي لوقف جميع الأعمال العدائية فورا بالأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة وضمان وصول المساعدات الإنسانية دون عوائق وإعادة المهاجرين الفلسطينيين إلى ديارهم ورفع القيود المفروضة على الخدمة الأساسية بما في ذلك الرعاية الصحية التي تأثرت بشكل كارثي خصوصا بالنسبة للنساء والفتيات. كما يعرب وفد بلادي عن إدانته لما وثقه التقرير بوضوح من تدهور خطير للأوضاع في الأراضي الفلسطينية منذ 7 أكتوبر 2023، حيث شهدت هذه الفترة انتهاكات جسيمة للقانون الدولي الإنساني وحقوق الإنسان في ظل استمرار العمليات العسكرية التي أسفرت عن ارتقاء ما يقارب 50,000 شهيد وإصابة ما يزيد على 100,000 آخرين، إضافة إلى تعميق الأزمة الإنسانية بسبب التهجير القسري والحصار المفروض على غزة. كما نؤكد إدانتنا لاستمرار وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في الضفة الغربية بما في ذلك القدس الشرقية وتصاعد العنف الممنهج ضد الفلسطينيين سواء من قبل قوات الاحتلال أو المستوطنين في ظل دعم رسمي يفاقم معاناة السكان ويقوض حقهم في تقرير المصير. سيدي الرئيس، إن استمرار غياب المساءلة قد أدى إلى تطبيع هذه الانتهاكات مما يستدعي تحركا دوليا عاجلا لضمان محاسبة جميع الأطراف المتورطة وفقا لما دعا إليه التقرير من تحقيقات مستقلة.
Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Tunisie.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يأخذ وفد بلادي علما بتقرير المفوض السامي ويجدد الإعراب عن استنكاره الشديد لما يتعرض له الشعب الفلسطيني ولا يزال من جرائم حرب وأعمال إبادة جماعية وانتهاكات ممنهجة لحقوق الإنسان على يد قوات الاحتلال دون مساءلة ولا محاسبة وأمام صمت دولي مريب. وإذ نؤكد من جديد على إدانة تونس بأشد العبارات لهذه الجرائم والانتهاكات، فإننا نهيب بالمجموعة الدولية أن تتحمل مسؤولياتها القانونية والأخلاقية في إطار الإيمان بالمساواة وبقيم العدالة والكرامة وبحرمة الذات البشرية بعيدا عن ازدواجية المعايير، وتتحرك فورا وبشكل فاعل ومسؤول لمنع كل مخططات التهجير القسري والاستيطان وانتهاك الأماكن المقدسة. كما نؤكد على وجوب فرض امتثال قوة الاحتلال التدابير التي أقرتها محكمة العدل الدولية وتنفيذها لقرار الجمعية العامة بشأن الرأي الاستشاري للمحكمة حول عدم قانونية الاحتلال ووجوب إنهائه الفوري وتفكيك الاستيطان. وفي الختام نؤكد مرة أخرى على موقف تونس الثابت والمبدئي المتعلق برفض تهجير الفلسطينيين وبحق الشعب الفلسطيني غير قابل للتصرف أو السقوط بالتقادم في استعادة حقه السليب في كل أرض فلسطين وإقامة دولته المستقلة وعاصمتها القدس الشريف. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, presidente. Señala el informe del alto comisionado que la situación en el terreno ha afectado a todos los derechos de los palestinos, incluido el derecho a la autodeterminación, siendo su pueblo objeto de bloqueos y cierres que equivalen a un castigo colectivo, y que dichas acciones han generado una crisis humanitaria catastrófica, entre otras razones por las restricciones de la ayuda humanitaria, el desplazamiento de aproximadamente el 90% de la población, la destrucción masiva de hospitales y otras infraestructuras civiles. El mundo es testigo del inocultable genocidio del pueblo palestino en Gaza, ejecutado con la complicidad de los mismos actores que se presentan como jueces morales, incluso en este Consejo. Es el colmo de la hipocresía. El pueblo palestino enfrenta hoy la amenaza de la ocupación total de su territorio por parte de Israel con el apoyo de los Estados Unidos. Este acto constituye un crimen de lesa humanidad que bajo ninguna circunstancia puede quedar impune. Hacemos un llamado a la comunidad internacional para fortalecer los acuerdos de cese al fuego y exigimos a Israel poner fin a más de 75 años de ocupación ilegal que viola flagrantemente el derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Señor presidente, Venezuela no se cansará de alzar su voz en defensa del derecho a la vida y a la autodeterminación del pueblo palestino. Abogamos por el fin del conflicto y la reconstrucción de Gaza, incluyendo una justa reparación a las víctimas y la debida rendición de cuentas por las vías del derecho humano. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the statements delivered by the OIC and African Group and reaffirm our unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people in their just struggle for self-determination. The systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza and general disregard for international humanitarian law, as highlighted in the HC's report, are a cause for alarm. We are equally concerned by the indiscriminate killing of civilians as well as the wanton destruction of Palestinian homes, which has resulted in forceful displacement. As well, it is highly regrettable that the orders of the International Court of Justice have been lightly ignored. We welcome the recent ceasefire agreement and urge both parties to respect the terms of the agreement to prevent further undue suffering of the civilian populations on both sides of the conflict. However, the ceasefire must be accompanied by meaningful efforts towards a just and lasting peace. To achieve this, we call for the lifting of all illegal restrictions on humanitarian aid, respect for international humanitarian law, and accountability for the attendant violations. Finally, we reiterate our unwavering support for a two-state solution based on international law and relevant UN resolutions. A sovereign and independent state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital alongside Israel remains the only viable path to a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for presenting the report pursuant to HRC Resolution 5528. Pakistan remains gravely concerned over the unconscionable human rights and humanitarian situation in illegally occupied Palestinian territory, particularly Gaza. We reject any false equivalence between the occupation forces and those under illegal occupation as inconsistent with international law. We condemn in strongest terms the staggering loss of civilian life and wholesale destruction of civilian infrastructure throughout the OPT by the occupying power. Notwithstanding the current ceasefire, a just and lasting peace requires the primacy of international law, starting with the right to self-determination to be re-established. The occupation must be held to account for attempting to dismantle the international legal framework with its brazen disregard for the obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We unequivocally reject any proposals that seek to displace or relocate Palestinian people from their ancestral homeland as unacceptable, and it constitutes a flagrant violation of every cardinal principle of international law and the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Pakistan underscores the urgent necessity of unhindered humanitarian support at scale to the Palestinian people. Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine must end in line with the ICJ's advisory opinion and relevant resolutions of the UN and the OIC. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. El 7 de octubre del año 23, Israel sufrió el ataque más mortífero contra el pueblo judío desde el Holocausto. Esto no fue una escalada de violencia ni un conflicto con responsabilidades compartidas. Fue un acto deliberado de terrorismo llevado a cabo por Hamás. La masacre, que tuvo como blancos civiles inocentes, incluidos ancianos, mujeres que padecieron agresiones de todo tipo, niños, inclusive de cortísima edad, asesinados a manos de los terroristas, conmocionaron al mundo y subrayaron la gravedad de esta agresión. Señor presidente, la República Argentina condena de la forma más enérgica el informe del Alto Comisionado que se presenta bajo el mandato de la Resolución 5528. Este informe desvirtúa todos los principios que Naciones Unidas dice defender. Es inaceptable e inconcebible que el documento procure una mitigación del horror que está a la vista de todos. No existe equivalencia moral entre Israel y Hamás. Israel es un Estado democrático que como nación soberana y por legítima defensa tiene la obligación de proteger a su población frente a un ataque de tamaña atrocidad. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية يضم وفد بلاد صوته إلى بيانات المجموعات التي ينتمي إليها، ويشكر المفوض السامي على إحاطته وجهوده في متابعة حالة حقوق الإنسان في فلسطين. ويشكر وفد بلادي المفوض السامي على إحاطته وجهوده في متابعة حالة حقوق الإنسان في فلسطين المحتلة، ولكننا نعرب عن القلق الشديد إزاء ما يرد في التقارير الأممية من مساواة بين القوة القائمة بالاحتلال، القوة المعتدية، والشعب الفلسطيني الذي يرزخ تحت نيران الاستعمار منذ عقود. نجدد إدانتنا للانتهاكات التي ترتكبها القوى القائمة بالاحتلال ولا سيما في غزة، والتي ترقى إلى أفعال الإبادة وجرائم الحرب. ونجدد على ضرورة تنفيذ التدابير الاحترازية لمحكمة العدل الدولية، كما نرفض المحاولات الرامية إلى تصفية القضية الفلسطينية من خلال ضم الأراضي وتهجير الفلسطينيين، الأمر الذي يعد انتهاكا خطيرا للقانون الدولي الإنساني. السيد الرئيس، نؤكد على ضرورة تمكين لجنة التحقيق الدولية المستقلة من دخول الأراضي الفلسطينية حتى تتمكن من القيام بولايتها في رصد وتوثيق انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني التي ترتكبها القوى القائمة بالاحتلال. وختاما، نؤكد على حق الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق في تقرير مصيره وإقامة دولته المستقلة وعاصمة القدس الشريف. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. We, however, remain deeply disturbed by the persistent lack of accountability for Israel's violations and abuses perpetrated against the Palestinian people in the OPT. We call on the OHCHR to take all necessary measures within its mandate to investigate the grave violations and abuses against the Palestinian people with a view to end Israel's impunity in the OPT. Namibia firmly believes that the only viable solution to this conflict is a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. We denounce any plans to forcibly displace the Palestinian people from their land, and we call on the international community to exert pressure on Israel to end the illegal occupation of Palestinian land in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions and the ICG rulings. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Niger salue et remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour son rapport sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans les territoires palestiniens occupés, y compris Jérusalem-Est. Ma délégation exprime sa profonde préoccupation face à la persistance de l'occupation des territoires et des attaques perpétrées contre des personnes et des services de base en violation flagrante du droit international humanitaire et du droit international, et condamne dans les termes les plus énergiques les atrocités brutales commises par la puissance occupante contre les civils palestiniens depuis plus de 7 décennies. En particulier, les dernières brutalités horribles qui sont d'une autre génération. À ce titre, ma délégation exhorte la communauté internationale, en particulier sa composante dite libre et démocratique, à faire arrêter cette forme inavouée de punition collective en cours à Gaza, conformément aux valeurs que la dite composante prétend défendre dans d'autres coins du monde, y compris au moyen des sanctions économiques et financières. Pour finir, le Niger réaffirme son soutien à la solution à 2 États, Israël et Palestine, vivant côte à côte dans la paix, la sécurité et la confiance mutuelle sur les frontières d'avant 1967, fondée sur un État de Palestine libre et sûr, conformément aux résolutions pertinentes de l'ONU, notamment la résolution 1515 du 19 novembre 2003 du Conseil de sécurité, celle gage d'une paix durable. Je vous remercie.
Merci. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand thanks the High Commissioner for the report. Thailand welcomes the ongoing implementation of the ceasefire and hostage release agreement in the Gaza Strip. We commend all international efforts in this regard. It is imperative that all parties continue to fulfill their commitments and that all 3 phases of the ceasefire agreement are fully implemented. Most urgently on the release of all hostages and detainees, to further de-escalate tensions and foster an environment conducive to achieving a peaceful solution. It is crucial that all parties respect international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law. A timely and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance by the Palestinian people and all those in need must also be ensured. Thailand reiterates our unwavering support for diplomacy and constructive dialogue based on the 2-state solution, by which the states of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security, in accordance with international law and the relevant United Nations resolutions, as well as for sustained peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
主席先生，中方对巴勒斯坦备占领土，特别是加沙地区的人权状况和严峻的人道局势深表关切。我们对当事方达成停火协议表示欢迎。当务之急是持续有效地落实停火协议，并建设性地推进后续谈判。占领方应当切实履行国际法义务，尊重和保护巴勒斯坦民众的人权，保障流离失所者安全返回家园。两国方案是解决巴勒斯坦问题的唯一出路。加沙是巴勒斯坦领土不可分割的一部分。中方坚定支持巴勒斯坦人民的合法民主权利，认为8人制8是加沙战后治理应当遵循的重要原则。我们反对针对加沙民众的强制迁移。我们呼吁各方切实重视阿拉伯国家，特别是巴勒斯坦的愿望和诉求，为缓解有关地区的人道危机，推动巴勒斯坦问题全面、公正、持久的解决，做出应有的努力。谢谢主席先生。
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. وفد السودان يضم صوته لبيانات المجموعة العربية والمجموعة الأفريقية ومجموعة دول منظمة التعاون الإسلامي ومجموعة حركة عدم الانحياز. نجدد دعمنا لإبقاء البند محل النقاش ضمن أجندة المجلس. نعبر عن تضامننا الكامل مع الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق الذي ظل يعاني لعقود أشكالا متنوعة من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان متمثلة في فقد الأرواح والممتلكات والإصابات والتشريد. وأمامنا الحالة المؤلمة التي تجري بغزة بكل تفاصيلها ومظاهرها والعدوان القاشم على لبنان وشعبه الشقيق. إن حل القضية الفلسطينية يتمثل في إنهاء حالة الاحتلال ووقف التعدي المستمر على الأراضي الفلسطينية وبناء المستوطنات وعودة اللاجئين إلى ديارهم وضمان حق الشعب الفلسطيني في ممارسة تقرير مصيره وإقامة دولته المستقلة على أساس وحدود الشرعية الدولية. السودان يؤكد تأييده للمجهودات الداعية لإنهاء دورة العنف والوصول إلى حل نهائي للأزمة المتطاولة بكل تفاصيلها، ويدعو القوى القائمة بالاحتلال إلى التقييد بالتزاماتها الناشئة بموجب القانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية وبمبادئ القانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني. ندعو المجلس الموقر للتصدي لانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان بما في ذلك تلك المتعلقة بالأسرى والفئات الضعيفة مثل الأطفال والنساء والمسنين.
Microphone, sorry.
الثاني في السودان يشيد في هذا الإطار بالدعم المقدم عبر الأمم المتحدة والنظام الدولية أو عبر الدول، ويرحب بالتمويل المقدم. السودان يدعو المجتمع الدولي لمضاعفة الجهود للاستجابة للأزمة الإنسانية في غزة، ويشيد في هذا الإطار بالدعم المقدم عبر الأمم المتحدة والنظام الدولية أو عبر الدول، ويرحب بالتمويل المقدم لوكالة الأونروا حتى تتمكن من مواصلة مجهوداتها القيمة في دعم الشعب الفلسطيني. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, and sorry about the interruption. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda.
Mr. President, we are concerned by the grave situation that continues to unfold in the occupied Palestinian territory. Uganda welcomes the current ceasefire and the recent release of captives. We reiterate the need for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza to safeguard civilians and any further destruction. We commend the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and United States in this regard. The humanitarian impact of the conflict on civilian population demands urgent attention and resolution. We call on the international community to increase humanitarian assistance and also call for all necessary support towards the reconstruction of the destroyed infrastructure in Gaza. We call for an end to the blockade and the expansion of settlement activity, which continues to be a significant driver of tension and violence. As fragile as it is now, the international community, regional actors, the parties, and all of us must exert all efforts to pursue a just and comprehensive peace in the Middle East. This should be based on relevant UN resolutions to achieve a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Liban.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Lebanon thanks the High Commissioner and OHCHR for their monitoring of the current dramatic events in the OPTs. We have reached a phase where occupation, violence, denial of rights, and dehumanization are in full sway. Palestinian civilians are massacred and deprived of life basic necessities. They are forcibly displaced and exposed to starvation and epidemics. Furthermore, by hindering access to humanitarian aid and by vilifying UN agencies, including UNRWA, the occupying power dashes the hopes of Palestinians for a better future. This terrifying situation largely stems from the international community's inability to rein in Israel or to hold it accountable for its numerous violations of IHL and human rights of Palestinians. We hope that the Gaza ceasefire will be durable and would pave the way for ending the occupation. There is no alternative to a just and lasting solution to the conflict that safeguards the Palestinian people's rights, including to self-determination. This is key for preventing further subjugation of the Palestinians and for preserving the credibility of the principles we are supposed to uphold in this Council, let alone security and stability in the Middle East region. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland.
Mr. President, a long-awaited ceasefire in Gaza has brought cautious hope to us all. It has provided an opportunity to bring life-saving humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and in the longer term must provide basis for them to rebuild their lives after a most devastating war. The High Commissioner's report outlines a long-standing lack of accountability and environment of impunity in Israel. This has continued to enable violations of international law with an unprecedented impact on the lives and rights of Palestinians. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, we welcome the recent releases of hostages that have been held in Gaza, and we wish them and their families well in rebuilding their lives after the unimaginable ordeal. We condemn the way in which Hamas has treated the bodily remains of hostages. All hostages and prisoners, whether Israeli or Palestinian, must be treated with dignity and respect, both the living and the dead. They should be neither paraded nor degraded. Regrettably, we meet at a time when the ceasefire in Gaza seems very fragile. Let me unequivocally call on all parties to ensure that the ceasefire is upheld. War should not be an option, let alone an objective. The ceasefire must not fail. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour son rapport. Après 15 mois de conflit marqués par des violations systématiques des principes du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains et des souffrances indescriptibles de la population civile, il est aujourd'hui vital de préserver le cessez-le-feu et de garantir l'accès continu de l'aide humanitaire à Gaza. Nous appelons le Hamas à libérer tous les otages dans le respect de leur dignité. Le Luxembourg continue à soutenir l'UNRWA qui joue un rôle irremplaçable de soutien à la population palestinienne. Nous sommes préoccupés par l'intensification des raids militaires israéliens et de la violence des colons en Cisjordanie. La reprise d'un processus politique visant à réaliser la solution à deux États, respectant pleinement le droit à l'autodétermination des Israéliens et des Palestiniens, reste la seule issue vers une paix juste et durable. La bande de Gaza doit faire partie intégrante d'un État palestinien indépendant. Toutes les tentatives de créer un État de fait par des déplacements forcés de la population ou la construction de colonies sont inacceptables. Il est indispensable de mettre fin à l'impunité et d'assurer que justice soit faite pour tous les crimes de guerre et autres violations du droit international humanitaire. Le Luxembourg soutient pleinement le rôle de la Cour pénale internationale et de la Cour internationale de justice. À cet égard, je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, merci pour votre rapport. Expression du devoir de vigilance et de témoignage impartial du Haut-Commissariat et de ce Conseil. Horreur des attentats terroristes barbares du 7 octobre conduits par le Hamas et de l'interminable prise d'otages. La France y a perdu 50 des siens. Aujourd'hui, elle pleure la mort d'Ohad Yahalomi et partage la douleur de sa famille. Le retour des otages et la restitution des corps doivent respecter leur dignité. Horreur des opérations conduites à Gaza, qui laissent une population décimée et un territoire dévasté. À la racine de tout cela, le conflit israélo-palestinien qui affecte les peuples et les personnes et bafoue leurs droits et le blocage du processus de paix. Pour revenir à la paix, la France appelle tout d'abord au respect par toutes les parties de l'accord de cessez-le-feu. L'accès à toute la bande de Gaza doit être garanti par Israël aux acteurs humanitaires et le travail de ces derniers facilité conformément au droit international humanitaire. La France déplore les victimes civiles et les déplacés provoqués par les opérations israéliennes dans le nord de la Cisjordanie. Elle appelle les autorités israéliennes à assurer, conformément au droit international, la protection de la population civile. La colonisation illégale doit cesser, tout comme les violences commises par certains colons. La France est mobilisée en faveur de la mise en œuvre effective de la solution à deux États. C'est dans cet objectif qu'elle coprésidera à New York en juin 2025 avec l'Arabie saoudite une conférence internationale pour la mise en œuvre de cette solution. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Belgique.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your report. With Gaza ceasefire in place, reports like yours are fundamental to achieve, if not now, then in the future, accountability for the violations of IHL and of international human rights law by Israeli forces, Hamas and others. Accountability is a crucial part of any process of transitional justice and ultimately sustainable peace. Mr. President, Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement. We remain deeply concerned about the lack of dignity for Palestinians returning to their homes in the absence of shelter and basic infrastructure, and we are also worried about the conditions under which both hostages and detainees are released. Belgium is alarmed by the methods used by Israeli forces in the West Bank, including airstrikes, bulldozers and advanced weaponry, resulting in killings, wanton destruction and the displacements of tens of thousands of refugees. We strongly condemn the further escalation of violence by extremist settlers. We urge Israel to protect the population in the territory it occupies in line with law enforcement rules and applicable human rights norms and standards.
High Commissioner, impunity for settler violence in the West Bank is a big challenge today. How could it affect the prospects for a lasting ceasefire and a two-state solution? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. في البدء يضم وفد بلادي صوته للبيانات المقدمة من المجموعات السياسية والإقليمية التي ينتمي إليها. هذا وقد أحطنا علما بمضمون تقرير المفوض السامي محل النظر، وإذ نؤكد على أهمية ما تضمنه من توصيات واستنتاجات وأهمية وضعها موضع التنفيذ لرفع المعاناة عن الشعب الفلسطيني. السيد الرئيس، يرزق المدنيون الفلسطينيون في قطاع غزة تحت وطأة مأساة مؤلمة متعددة الفصول، ليس فقط بسبب الأرواح التي يزحق، بل وأيضا نتيجة حرمانها من الغذاء والماء والدواء والرعاية الصحية والتعليم والخدمات الأساسية. وأحسب لزاما توفير المساعدات الفورية للمدنيين في غزة بما يتضمن تمتعهم بحقوقهم الأساسية الإنسانية، وبما يصون ويحفظ أرواحهم وكرامتهم ويقلل من حدة معاناتهم التي طال أمدها. سيد الرئيس، ختاما فإن مملكة البحرين تدعو المجتمع الدولي للاطلاع بمسؤولياته في فرض تطبيق القرارات الدولية وقواعد القانون الدولي الإنساني وحماية المدنيين الأبرياء والمساعدات الإنسانية لسكان قطاع غزة بشكل آمن وكامل واستدام، وتهيئة الأجواء الآمنة لإحياء عملية السلام لوضع الحصول على حل الدولتين المشروع بقامتها وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brunei Dar es Salaam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our full statement will be uploaded on the extranet. Brunei Dar es Salaam aligns itself with the statement by the OIC. We are especially concerned with the observation on the unprecedented levels of food insecurity and the concerns of deliberately inflicting starvation on the population of Gaza as a method of warfare that is prohibited by international law. We remain deeply concerned that the actions of the occupying power have frequently provoked and deepened the fear that they will set dangerous precedents by destabilizing the whole region and weakening the basis of the international order. We cannot sit idly by and let this continue. We cannot pick and choose the application of international law, including upholding obligation to the decisions of international courts only when it is suitable. Mr. President, Brunei Dar es Salaam urges the international community to uphold its responsibility in protecting the rights of the Palestinians and in addressing the root causes, including returning to their homeland, and to ensure that all parties concerned honor the ceasefire agreement. Brunei Dar es Salaam also acknowledges efforts at finding a just, comprehensive and lasting solution to conflict, and in doing so, we stress upon the importance of involving all concerned parties in any plans with the full adherence to international law and all relevant UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. We remain resolute in our solidarity with the Palestinian people and advocate for Palestinians' full membership of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. We welcome the ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza and urge its full implementation in all its phases. We need to see the return of all hostages to their families and continued access for much-needed humanitarian aid into Gaza. The work of UNRWA is essential and irreplaceable in this regard. A return to hostilities would be disastrous for everyone. Turning to the report, we regret that the office has not been granted full access to the Occupied Palestinian Territory and to Israel to investigate violations by all duty bearers. We urge Israel to ensure this access. The scale of gross violations of rights and disregard for obligations under international law detailed in the report is appalling. We share the High Commissioner's concern about the long-standing lack of accountability and the prevailing environment of impunity which continues to enable international law violations. We urge all states parties to the Rome Statute to comply with their obligations and reiterate the High Commissioner's call upon all duty bearers to ensure cooperation with the International Criminal Court. Recalling the ICJ advisory opinion, we call on Israel to comply with its obligation to bring an end to its unlawful presence in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. President, we need to see a political pathway towards implementation of a two-state solution, the only viable path to a lasting peace and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. We also align with the OIC statement. Bangladesh strongly condemns the unspeakable atrocities on and indiscriminate killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, including women, children, older persons and persons with disabilities, particularly since October 2023. We demand the permanent end of Israeli brutalities in Palestine. The flagrant violation of international law by Israel for decades need to be addressed by the international community by holding Israel accountable and putting an end to the culture of impunity. Bangladesh reiterates its strong support for a lasting ceasefire. We call upon the international community to make Israel refrain from committing ceasefire violations. We call for rapid, safe, and unhindered provision of life-saving assistance to Gaza. We also call for undertaking rebuilding initiatives to ensure the rapid return of the displaced Palestinians to their homes. We call for full implementation of the provisional measures ordered by the ICJ relating to the proceedings brought under the Geneva Convention. Finally, Bangladesh reiterates its strong support for an end to Israel's occupation of Palestine and for a lasting and permanent solution that ensures the establishment of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state along pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Nous allons maintenant procéder à la liste des orateurs des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme et des organisations non gouvernementales. Je donne la parole au Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights.
President, among with all the dreadful crimes, crime against humanity, and the live-streamed genocide in Gaza, Israel continues to escalate its violations by systematically withholding the bodies of Palestinians it has killed. In 2024 alone, it seized 192 bodies from the West Bank, bringing the total to 646 held in mortgages and cemeteries of numbers. This does not include the hundreds of victims from Gaza whose fate remains unknown, while families are denied the right to bury their beloved ones with dignity. Among the withheld bodies are 59 children, 67 prisoners who were killed or died in Israeli detention, and 9 women. Since October 7th, Israel has also subjected thousands, including women, children, and medical personnel to enforced disappearance under the so-called unlawful combatant law, stripping detainees of all legal protection. This is a war crime and a blatant violation of international law. We call on the Human Rights Council to demand the immediate return of all withheld bodies, pressure Israel to disclose the fate of the disappeared, and ensure accountability for these grave violations. The dignity of the dead is a fundamental human right, and the world must not remain silent. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Defense for Children International.
Mr. President, the lack of accountability is a core reason why the State of Israel has been able to carry out its campaign of genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and pursue its project of annexation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. For decades, Israeli forces have systematically killed Palestinian children in huge numbers without consequence. The end of this systemic impunity will save the lives of countless Palestinian children and their families. As the only Palestinian human rights organizations focused exclusively on children's rights, we have thoroughly documented violations of Palestinian children's rights for decades. In that time, we have continuously advocated for justice and accountability for these rights violations, and we can say with confidence that there have been no meaningful measures of accountability for perpetrators. Israeli soldiers know that they can kill Palestinian children with impunity and not face any professional or legal consequences. Now, as Israel and its officials are finally facing the beginning of justice at the world's highest courts, some countries are choosing to continue to embolden impunity. Israeli forces will continue to kill Palestinian children without limit until world leaders support and enact strong measures of justice and accountability. We strongly urge all member states to protect the integrity of investigations by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court that aim to hold perpetrators accountable, including condemning sanctions and other punitive threats or actions towards members of the court, and use all available means to demand Israeli authorities uphold Palestinian children's rights as outlined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the State of Israel has ratified. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to United Nations Watch.
Hi, Commissioner. My name is Loy Ahmed, and I come from Yemen. May I ask why your report mentions Israel 188 times, yet fails to mention the Islamic regime in Iran even once? How can you speak about the conflict while ignoring the party that has armed, trained, and funded terror proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, who have been bombing Israel thousands of times? Why don't you mention the Houthis in Yemen, who have spent millions of dollars firing missiles at Israel instead of feeding my starving people? I ask the UN, the Arab League, and everyone who has been raising the Palestinian flag since October 7, Where is the flag of Yemen? In my country, 500,000 people have died in the last 10 years. The biggest famine and humanitarian crisis in modern history. Why does no one care when 500,000 Yemenis die? What about Sudan? In less than 2 years, more than 150,000 people have been killed. Where is the flag of Sudan? What about Syria? 500,000 Syrians have been killed. Where is the Syrian flag? High Commissioner, why is it that when Arabs kill millions of Arabs, no one bats an eye? Where is the outrage? And where are the protests? And why is Qatar sitting here as a member of the Human Rights Council when they host the Hamas terror leaders in luxury hotels?
Thank you. I give the floor to Roland Center.
The world now knows Palestinian savages murdered 9-month-old baby Kfir.
Sorry. I have to interrupt. And I invite all speakers to use language that is commensurate with the dignity inherent to our discussions here on human rights. Everyone has the right to express their views, but this should remain within the appropriate framework and terminology. As I said yesterday, tolerance and respect must be the guiding principles of the Council's work, and I will not tolerate disrespectful language. With this in mind, I give the floor back to this video statement.
Brother Ariel and their young mother Shiri Bibas with their bare hands. Palestinian barbarians mutilated their tiny bodies.
Stop the message, please. As I just said, the language used in this room must adhere to the rules of dignity and respect inherent to our discussion. The language that's used by the speaker cannot be tolerated. It exceeds clearly the limits of tolerance and respect within the framework of this Council, and I therefore give the floor to the next statement, the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. It's a joint statement, also by video.
President, international accountability or its opposite, impunity, do not happen organically or in a vacuum. Impunity is granted through the lack of action, and accountability must be imposed through practical measures. To uphold the principle of accountability, including the obligation of the international community to provide international protection, Badil calls on all states, individually and collectively, to impose political, economic, and military sanctions against the Israeli regime to hold it accountable. For over 76 years of ongoing forced displacement and transfer, colonization, and apartheid, and the ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip. For the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip and the reparations owed many times over to 9.17 million Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. For its perpetual refusal to adhere to its obligations, including ensuring the protection, operation, and full access of UNRWA to fulfill its mandate. Only sanctions can ensure an end to the impunity that the Israeli colonial apartheid regime enjoys, that the UN and its member states fulfill their obligations, and that the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and return are put into practice. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Institute for NGO Research, also by video.
As we've come to expect, the Accountability Report promotes false claims, ignores aid diversion, and erases Hamas atrocities. This year's version parrots false casualty data from Hamas, sanitized under a new Ministry of Health euphemism. Again, the report conflates combatant and civilian deaths to conceal the truth. Yet again, the report hides Hamas's fighting tactics in Gaza. The word tunnel appears nowhere in the report. The report continues to cover for UNRWA, the ICRC, and aid NGOs that for 18 years turned a blind eye while Hamas stole taxpayer money to turn all of Gaza into a military base. Yet again, the report gives a free pass to Hamas's sponsors Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. When will these actors be held accountable for Hamas murder and mayhem? The report promotes the Gaza starvation lie, as if the entire world has not seen Hamas's depraved ceremonies held in front of braying mobs, where apart from the poor hostages, not a starving Gazan is in sight. And most egregiously, the report erases 9-month-old baby Kfir and 4-year-old Ariel, who were stolen on October 7th to the terror layers of Gaza, where they were executed in cold blood and where their bodies were paraded in one of the most disgusting and horrific spectacles of modern times, while hundreds of Gazan children were brought to watch and cheer it on. Mr. President, where is the accountability to be found here?
I give the floor to the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy.
Commissioner, once again, this council convenes as Palestinians across historical Palestine endure ongoing land expropriations, mass killings, imprisonments, and state-sanctioned settler terror. The Gaza Strip, which endured 15 months of bombardment and an all-out genocide, is now facing an even deeper humanitarian crisis, while the same brutal tactics used in Gaza are being replicated on a smaller scale in the West Bank. Israeli military attacks, airstrikes, sieges, and mass arrests are intensifying, particularly in the northern West Bank, where 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced and at least 70 have been killed since the start of this year. As Israeli military actions continue to escalate in size and impact, so too do attacks by state-backed settlers, who continue to carry out attacks and expropriate more Palestinian land. Meanwhile, the blockade on the Gaza Strip after 15 months of genocide is preventing Palestinians from rebuilding their destroyed homes, leaving women in particular vulnerable. This is not a sudden crisis, but rather the continuation of a long-term agenda aimed at consolidating Israeli control. With an increasingly aggressive Israeli government and the growing influence of far-right elements, the prospect of full annexation in the West Bank seems more imminent than ever. Allowing Israel to continue with its violations without consequences only gives the green light to continue its course, especially in light of the ICJ's ruling on genocide and the provisional measures laid out by the ICC. What is needed is concrete action and concrete steps of international accountability. Until then, justice for Palestinians who face these violations for decades will not be realized. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Jerusalem Institute of Justice.
Mr. President, how much longer will this Council turn a blind eye to the truth? The latest report by the High Commissioner is just not biased. It is a clear distortion of reality. It condemns Israel for defending its people while downplaying the barbaric atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. Over 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered in their homes, entire families burned alive, women raped, children torn from their parents. Yet, this report reduces these horrors to nothing more than a passing remark, appalling and entirely wrong. Where is the outrage? Instead, the report is obsessed with demonizing Israel's response, ignoring the painful reality that Hamas uses Gaza's civilians as human shields, diverts humanitarian aid for terror, and rejects every ceasefire that would have saved lives. Israel's right, its duty to defend its citizens, is dismissed, while Hamas war crimes are met with soft language and excuses. This report is not about justice. It emboldens terrorism while vilifying the only democracy in the Middle East. It ignores the suffering of Israeli victims and betrays the very principles this Council claims to uphold. Enough is enough. The time has come for this Council to stop enabling Hamas and start demanding accountability from those who commit crimes, not those who fight to survive. Thank you.
I give the floor to the Palestinian Return Center.
Palestinian Return Center would like to thank Mr. High Commissioner and also highlight some important elements in the report. These include Israel's massive atrocities committed against Palestinians in Gaza, which amount to the crime of genocide. In regard to the occupied West Bank, the report notes the spike in Israel's killing and violations of human rights, which include collective punishment, gender-related violations, arbitrary detentions, torture, and ill treatment. It also importantly finds that serious concerns persist about the capacity and the willingness in the Israeli justice system to ensure accountability and its compliance with international standards. Israel has consistently failed to open investigations in cases where there is evidence of unlawful conduct by Israeli occupation forces. We emphasize the report's recommendation to ensure that all Palestinians displaced from and within Gaza are allowed to return to their homes by creating safe conditions and providing adequate alternatives to those whose homes have been rendered uninhabitable. Thank you.
I give the floor to the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Thank you. FIDH thanks the High Commissioner for the presentation of his report.
For decades, Israel has implemented a series of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices to establish and maintain an apartheid system based on racial domination and oppression over the Palestinian people. In parallel with its genocidal war on Gaza, enabled by the inaction and sometimes the unwavering support of third states, Israel has exploited the wartime context to launch an unprecedented assault on Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. FIDH's Palestinian and Israeli member organizations have documented a dramatic rise in human rights violations and international crimes, including the unlawful killing and forcible displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank, restrictions on their freedom of movement, state-backed settler violence, hundreds of arbitrary arrests and administrative detentions, and the torture of Palestinian detainees. Since the start of the Israeli military operation on 21st January, redirecting its military aggression to the West Bank, at least 45,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced and 33 have been killed, including 12 children. These mass human rights violations and international crimes underscore the entrenched impunity that allows Israel to perpetuate systematic violations without consequences. We call on states to recognize and address Israel's apartheid system, including by supporting the reconstitution of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid, to comply with arrest warrants issued by the ICC, to take immediate action against Israel's settlement enterprise in line with the ruling of the ICJ, including by instituting a ban on settlement imports and imposing sanctions on settlers, and to cease the sale or transfer of arms to Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Al Mezan Center for Human Rights.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, the atrocities in Gaza are not stopping, and the need for accountability is stronger than ever. As we speak, the people of Gaza endure one of the coldest weeks in recent memory. 6 Palestinian newborns have frozen to death as Israel continues to commit acts of genocide, including the deliberate obstruction of life-sustaining humanitarian aid. There is no accountability for Palestinians within the Israeli legal system. Decades of systematic injustice have shown that Israel's domestic mechanisms serve to shield perpetrators, not deliver justice to victims of international crimes. Investigations, on the rare occasions when they occur, are designed to absolve rather than convict. The Israeli legal system has never delivered justice for Palestinians and never will. Over the past year, the International Court of Justice has issued 3 provisional measures orders addressed to Israel. The court has also issued a landmark advisory opinion affirming the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Yet, Israel continues to violate these rulings with total impunity as the international community fails to enforce them. In a long overdue step, the International Criminal Court has issued warrants of arrest against the Israeli leadership, marking a critical moment in the pursuit of justice for Palestinians. However, impunity will persist unless ICC state parties ensure these warrants are executed. Attacks on the ICC are an assault on the entire international justice system and must be met with a firm and united response by the 125 state parties to the Rome Statutes. Justice delayed is justice denied. The time for action is now. Thank you.
I give the floor to Amnesty International.
Mr. President, for over 16 months, the world has been witnessing shocking levels of dehumanization, death, and destruction in the occupied Gaza Strip, where Amnesty International found that Israel has committed and is continuing to commit genocide against Palestinians. Israel continues to arbitrarily arrest scores of Palestinians across the occupied territory, subjecting them to horrific detention conditions, including torture and other forms of ill treatment. In the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, state-backed settler violence and Israeli military operations have resulted in killings, unprecedented destruction of civilian infrastructure, and unlawful transfer of Palestinians. Millions of people across the world have been incessantly protesting to demand justice for Palestinians. Yet, many states have remained defiant to these calls, often actively silencing pro-Palestinian solidarity, thus undermining the universal value of international law. International courts and human rights bodies, including this Council, and the whole international legal system are under attack. Amnesty International urges states to take immediate action. They must uphold international law by imposing an arms embargo on Israel, supporting the International Criminal Court and implementing its arrest warrants, and by complying with the International Court of Justice's orders on genocide and its 2024 advisory opinion declaring Israel's occupation unlawful. All mandates dealing with the current crisis must be adequately supported. Palestinians' rights must be protected.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Ceci était la dernière intervention qu'il nous est possible d'écouter. Et je redonne maintenant la parole au haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme pour ses remarques finales. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Just want to
offer some concluding remarks and observations in response to the debate, but also to answer the couple of questions that we have received. As you know, that for more than 15 years, my office has monitored, reported, and alerted on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory and the wide-ranging violations that stem from 57 years of military occupation by Israel, 17 years of blockade and closures of Gaza amounting to collective punishment, and the long-standing patterns of institutionalized discrimination and oppression of the Palestinian people in the occupied territory. In these reports, we have made numerous recommendations to member states to act. And in fact, I remember very well my first address to the Council in March 2023, where I've asked my colleagues to come back with the recurring findings of all these recommendations. And I have to say, and I had to conclude then, that most of these findings were unanswered. And it's important to bear this in mind as we look to the future. Over the past 16 months of the conflict in Gaza, we have monitored, reported, and warned again on grave violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, committed by all parties to the conflict, and we called on all parties and member states to ensure full respect for international law and accountability. This has included calls for ensuring urgent compliance with the orders for provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice and with the advisory opinion that the International Court of Justice issued last year. In doing so, my office has reported on violations by Israel, the PA, Hamas, and other Palestinian armed groups applying the same human rights standards. Despite severe access restrictions to my international staff in the occupied Palestinian territory, we are continuing within those resources to document, report, advocate, and bear witness on the ground. We do this in an impartial and objective manner, applying standard methodology. It is absolutely critical for the international community, obviously, to address the conflict's root causes, to insist vis-à-vis both parties that the current ceasefire holds and that negotiations on its next phase continue, to ensure the effective protection of civilians and the respect and the implementation of the rulings of the International Court of Justice. It's also important to act to support accountability for all violations, whether delivered through national institutions, through universal jurisdiction, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and or other processes. While it is not within my office's mandate to make judicial determinations as to individual criminal responsibility, victims of gross violations of international law have the right to an effective remedy, including reparation. With regard to UNRWA, and the UN position has been absolutely clear about this, is indispensable in addressing the critical needs of Palestinians, given it's the only entity with the mandate and capacity to ensure the delivery of assistance at the scale and breadth needed, including through operational support to other UN entities in the delivery of their humanitarian assistance mandate. UNRWA is not just an aid provider, it also embodies the commitment of the international community to address the fundamental and unresolved right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Even though the legislation has taken effect, it's critical for member states to continue providing political and financial support to UNRWA. On the West Bank, I've, in my opening remarks, found very clear wording based on the analysis where we indeed have seen the use of unnecessary and disproportionate force against Palestinians, the restrictions to movement, but also the displacement of tens of thousands of people, but also the continuous settlement activities, and again, international law is very clear, and the International Court of Justice has found clear statements to this effect, and we just have to, again, call on the respect for international law. On a more general level, I'm deeply troubled and worried, and I condemn the dangerous manipulation of language, the disinformation, and the resisting. And we need to make sure that we resist all efforts to spread fear or incite hatred, including abhorrent, dehumanizing narratives, whether they're insidious or explicit. My office will continue to work for justice for every victim and survivor by establishing and documenting the facts and standing firmly for accountability and the rule of law without exception. In the meantime, I reiterate my plea, my urgent plea, for the ceasefire to hold, for each phase to be implemented by both sides in good faith and in full, and for all of us to do everything in our power to build on it in order for the occupation to end and for lasting peace, where the Palestinians have been able to exercise their right to self-determination, and both Palestinians and Israelis to live in equal dignity and rights. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire. Ça nous amène à la fin de ce dialogue interactif. Je tiens à remercier le Haut-Commissaire pour sa participation. Nous allons prendre une très brève pause avant de commencer le dialogue interactif renforcé sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Érythrée. Merci. Excellences, Excellences, distingués collègues, je vous prie de prendre vos places. On va continuer. S'il vous plaît. Merci. Nous allons maintenant procéder au dialogue interactif renforcé sur les droits de l'homme en Érythrée, conformément à la résolution 56/17. Permettez-moi de souhaiter la bienvenue à nos distingués intervenants, Madame Ilse Brandes-Keris, sous-secrétaire générale aux droits de l'homme. Merci d'être là. Monsieur Mohamed Abdel Salam Babiker, rapporteur spécial sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Érythrée. Bonjour et merci d'être là. Monsieur Abdom Seraï, chargé d'affaires de la mission permanente de l'Érythrée auprès de l'ONU et d'autres organisations internationales à Genève. Et Monsieur Johannes Gebreviert, représentant de la société civile. La liste des orateurs sera close dans 15 minutes. J'ai l'honneur de donner la parole à la sous-secrétaire générale pour sa présentation. Madame, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Excellencies, I would like to update the Human Rights Council on the human rights situation in Eritrea since the enhanced interactive dialogue in 2024. According to the government, steps have been taken towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, namely in the areas of education and health. In 2024, the government, in partnership with the UN system, reportedly provided essential health services to more than 1 million newborns, children and women. Eritrea reports 95% immunization coverage among children. The authorities also report that there were 2,351 schools in 2023, up from 1,930 in 2015. Enrollments at the primary, middle and secondary levels have also reportedly increased. Gender parity is reported to have been attained at primary level, and efforts are being made to increase girls' participation at higher levels. Eritrea further reported that it had conducted a mapping study of girls who had undergone female genital mutilation, FGM, in 2024 on 1,086 villages, which revealed that only 2.3% under the age of 5 and 4.4% of girls under 15 had undergone FGM. Currently, 12 of Eritrea's 67 subzones are FGM-free, according to the government. Eritrea also ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in December 2024. I recognize the good work being accomplished by the UN country team in support of the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals for all Eritreans. Our teams in Nairobi and Addis Ababa are ready to support Eritrea to implement the commitments undertaken last year during its Universal Periodic Review, including those on peace, justice, and on supporting stronger institutions. But despite these reported improvements, serious concerns remain. Eritrea continues to subject citizens to indefinite military service, contrary to international human rights norms and to calls from this Council and other human rights mechanisms. Within the context of the system of indefinite forced conscription, other grave human rights violations are also of concern, including torture, sexual and gender-based violence, and abusive labor practices. The system further compels many young people to flee the country on perilous journeys, exposing them to high risks of sexual violence, trafficking, and other forms of human rights violations. Eritrea has so far not heeded this Council's call to limit the national service to the statutory period of 18 months. In addition, no steps have been taken to stop the inhumane practice of punishing family members for the actions of draft deserters. More broadly, our office continues to receive credible reports of torture, arbitrary detention, inhumane detention conditions, enforced disappearances, and restrictions on the rights of freedoms of expression, of association, and of peaceful assembly. Many politicians, journalists, religious believers, and draft deserters are held in incommunicado detention. Detention without trial remains the norm in Eritrea. Mr. President, Eritrea has so far not undertaken any credible steps to reform its legal and justice systems in line with international standards. Neither have we seen any evidence of political will to tackle impunity for past human rights violations, including those documented by the Commission of Inquiry in 2014 and 2016, nor the more recent ones by the joint OHCHR Ethiopia Human Rights Commission investigation team in 2023 for serious human rights violations committed by the Eritrean Defense Forces in the context of the Tigray conflict. This impunity continues to embolden perpetrators of human rights violations. In the current context, there is no likely prospect that the domestic judicial system will hold perpetrators accountable for the violations committed in the context of the Tigray conflict and in other cases. Moreover, the Eritrean Defense Forces are in violation of the cessation of hostilities agreement signed in November 2022 that called for the withdrawal of international forces from Ethiopian territory. Our office has credible information that Eritrean Defense Forces remain in Tigray and are committing violations, including abductions, rape, property looting, and arbitrary arrests. I call for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean Defense Forces from Tigray. Excellencies, against this backdrop, Eritrea's engagement with human rights mechanisms is all the more important. Eritrea was reviewed by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child earlier this year, which noted some progress as well as challenges in several areas, including freedom of expression, religion, and corporal punishment. Our office calls on Eritrea to extend full cooperation to international human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea and the relevant thematic special procedures mandates holders, namely those who have requested a visit, including the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association. Our office also calls on Eritrea to submit overdue reports to the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the Committee Against Torture. We stand ready to work with Eritrea to implement in good faith its commitment to strengthen our engagement. This includes work on the 5 areas identified jointly following our last technical visit in May 2022, namely 1, enhancing rights as part of a transformative justice system, 2, the harmonization of indigenous or traditional laws in line with international and regional human rights norms, 3, support to a regional conference on traditional justice, 4, enhancing the rights and protection of persons with disabilities, and also 5, capacity building on effective engagement with UN human rights mechanisms. The office urges member states to continue encouraging and facilitating Eritrea's engagement with the office, the Human Rights Council, and its mechanisms. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne maintenant la parole au rapporteur spécial sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Érythrée pour sa présentation.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to address you in my capacity as the Special Rapporteur during this enhanced interactive dialogue on Eritrea. I recognize Eritrea's increased engagement with some universal human rights mechanisms over the past year, including its participation in his fourth Universal Periodic Review and his review by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I also welcome Eritrea's ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I am encouraged by these developments and hope they reflect Eritrea's willingness not only to engage at the international level, but also to take action to improve the situation on the ground by implementing the recommendations of various human rights mechanisms. At the same time, I regret Eritrea continues to ignore my request to meet with the government representatives to visit the country. I reiterate my willingness to engage with the Eritrean authorities in a constructive spirit. Your Excellencies, the reality is that Eritrea continues to face a grave and long-standing human rights crisis, characterized by the repression of fundamental rights, impunity, and complete lack of access to justice for victims. The widespread and systematic suppression of freedoms of association, assembly, expression, and opinion over the last 3 decades has created a climate of fear. As a result, there are no independent media outlets, civil society organizations, or political parties in Eritrea. Freedom of religion or belief is repressed, with periodic waves of arrest, of mass arrest, and efforts to control all aspects of religious life and institutions. The situation of Eritrean victims of enforced disappearance remains extremely concerning. Hundreds of families of disappeared Eritreans live with agony of uncertainty. This is the plight of dozens of Eritrean Muslim leaders and teachers disappeared since the 90s. Religious figures, political dissidents, journalists like Siam Teshai and Daud Isaac. The situation is